Yeah, I can pretend I'm getting better at JavaScript. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. This episode is sponsored by Component One, makers of Widgmo. If you need stunning UI elements or awesome graphs and charts, then go to widgmo.com and check them out. This podcast is sponsored by JetBrains, makers of WebStorm. Whether you're working with Node.js or building the front end of your web application, WebStorm is the tool for you. It has great code quality and code exploration tools, and works with HTML5, Node, TypeScript, CoffeeScript, Harmony, Less, Sass, Jade, JSLint, JSHint, and the Google Clojure compiler. Check it out at jetbrains.com/webstorm. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 66 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Joe Eames.
Hi there.
And Merrick Christensen.
Hey guys.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we're going to be talking about, I think it's kind of a blend of making the transition from one primary language to JavaScript. It usually happens through web development, and some of the mistakes that people make when their primary language is not JavaScript. So let's go ahead and get started. Merrick, you're kind of the expert guy that I always look at and go, man, he's awesome at JavaScript. So I'm wondering, did you start out in JavaScript, or did you come in from somewhere else?
Oh, that's really nice of you, man. I actually started out with ActionScript. I really love Flash developments, but it's kind of the same thing, really. I mean, they're both based off of ECMAScript. So I guess you could say I've always done JavaScript.
So ActionScript is like nearly identical to JavaScript?
Well, not anymore. ActionScript 3 developed classes, and they typed it, and they did some interesting things to make it more of a full-featured language. It's got more akin to Dart than JavaScript now, I think. But I ended up getting into JavaScript when I was like 17 or so. I came across the MooTools framework, and ever since then, it's been all JavaScript all the time.
You're pretty young. Wasn't that last year?
Close. No, about 6 years, 5 years of JavaScript.
So you're also, though, like a real student of languages. You love studying other languages.
I love programming languages, yeah.
So I think you're a pretty funny, or sorry, not necessarily unique, because I think there's a lot of like people that are taking the same path as you nowadays. But it's pretty unique for people. Nobody with 10 years of experience has done this, but learning JavaScript first and then moving to or learning other languages. That's a pretty unique path.
Yeah, that's true. I've always wanted to build things for the web. So at first I was Flash, because you used to couldn't do the things you can do with JavaScript now that you could do with Flash. So whatever building rich experiences on the web is what I've kind of been interested in. But lately I've been, I guess, broadening my horizon into things that other people are leaving, like back-end and compile languages and things like that.
Right.
Yeah, and then Joe, you worked for Captain Picard in the Enterprise, right? You did that?
I did. That's a funny way to put that. Yeah, I worked for Bill Gates.
Oh, yeah.
Captain Picard in the Enterprise. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, in layman's terms, Joe came from .NET.
Yeah. I was one of the Bill Gates sheep, although I never really considered myself to be a sheep. Like, I have said this before, and I do think that there's a problem that too many .NET developers don't realize that you can do .NET, but you don't have to do like 100% of what Microsoft shoves down your throat and still be a .NET developer. A while ago, there was this movement called alt.NET, ALT.NET, and it really died, but I always kind of felt like that was really in line with how I felt, right? Like, there were all the things that Microsoft did well, I loved, but I was really open to the fact that they didn't do everything well, and not 100% of .NET developers are like that. I don't know what the percentages are, but I know that there are developers out there that just accept what Microsoft says, and that there are developers out there that realize that there are other alternatives for different pieces, other technologies that work great that aren't built by Microsoft that still work well with Microsoft. And Microsoft as a company, thankfully, is starting to admit that and really embrace. They've embraced Node really well. They're embracing web technologies that they don't really own. So I think it's nice to see Microsoft responding to that.
Yeah, I've met some hardcore .NET developers that I swear when they wake up, the boot song from Windows plays in their head or something. But and you try and talk to them about anything else, and they always hark back to the custom controls that Microsoft gives you for web and other development, and they have no idea that what it really boils down to, so that it works on the browser, is that it's a control that's built in JavaScript that has some hook to the back end.
Yeah, and I think in my career I've seen that that's a slight minority, that most people are more aware, but I think it's helpful when people point out the fact and help others to know that you can blend in other stuff. So, and there's a lot of great Microsoft developers out there that understand how wide the world is. Mm-hmm. And I think I was one of those guys.
I love that anytime somebody tells me they're using Knockout, I could be like, oh, so you got a .NET backend? And they'll be like, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, but my biggest issues with .NET really come down to the fact that you have to pay through the nose in order to get a Windows server, and pay through the nose to get Visual Studio and stuff. And other than that, I mean, the tools are fine, the server's fine, the OS is fine, But yeah, I really have problems coughing up that kind of money.
Those licensing fees never bothered me.
Because somebody else paid them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Plus, there's open alternatives, right? Isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it? I don't know. There's some C#.
There's Mono.
Mono, that's it.
And I've said this many times when people have brought that up, to defend Microsoft, because I do think that they do lots of good stuff. But by the time you get to any reasonably sized project, the tiny ones, it's different. But for any reasonably sized project, the licensing fees are, such a small percentage. It's kind of like buying a car because of the tires. Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Choosing the car based on the brand of tires. I got to have Toyota tires, so I've got to buy this particular brand of car,
My problem is that if I want to change my color scheme, I'm kind of stuck using Visual Studio.
Hey, the new one I think comes with 4 color schemes.
4 color schemes?
Yeah.
Woohoo! Touche.
No, I think the new one is a bit better. I haven't actually used 2012, but I think it's a little bit better, and they've responded to the fact that there's so many people out there that live and die by whether or not it's cream or, 2 shades lighter than cream.
So Joe, what misconceptions need to be shattered to move from full-time C# to JavaScript?
So, wow, that's a big question. So I made a pretty typical transition, right? I started doing full-time C#, and then we were doing web, and we didn't do any JavaScript, and all the JavaScript that we had was what Microsoft put down there. And then I slowly did more and more JavaScript to make my pages do more and more. And then one day I thought, I just like doing web stuff, I'm going to do full JavaScript. So the misconceptions that I had as I moved to JavaScript, one of them was that JavaScript was a garbage language. I think that was my first misconception, which is kind of an opinionated thing. I mean, sometimes even I'll say that, being a full-time JavaScript developer. Like we've said that before, the best thing about JavaScript is the fact that it's so versatile, you can plug the terrible holes in it.
Yeah.
But I think that was the first misconception, that it was a pain in the butt to learn, and that it was a garbage language, and C# is so nice and neat and orderly, and it fits into these little square boxes, and JavaScript doesn't. And so I think that was my first misconception I had to get over, was just the language of JavaScript, that it was actually approachable. And once I just forced myself, like I had this page that I just could not do with postbacks, which was the Microsoft way, and so I had to do full JavaScript. And so I had to learn JavaScript for real. It was no more 20 lines of JavaScript on the page. It was actually, like several hundred lines. Once I forced myself to do that, all of a sudden I realized, hey, this is a pretty approachable language and pretty easy to learn. And I could really get some stuff done. Yeah. But I know that you've seen this a lot. People come from another language and they don't do idiomatic JavaScript, right?
Yeah, well, one thing that's really frustrated me as someone who's been in the JavaScript world for a long time is seeing people act like JavaScript had nothing structured or orderly at all until Angular was invented. I've heard that so many times now, and I think it's in the long run, it's going to be really good for JavaScript to get more developers into the scene. But I've seen so many people be like, "Oh yeah, I couldn't test JavaScript until Angular came around," and it's it's like that's or like JavaScript had no structure before Angular came around, etc. And I'm glad that Angular made it more approachable for those people, but sometimes that can be super frustrating for me.
Well, I heard people say the same thing about jQuery or about Prototype, or pick your favorite poison. I've heard people say it about Require.js. I just couldn't deal with it until I had modules.
Yeah, it's true, and it's so interesting how just certain tools make things seem or make things more approachable.
That's a great misconception that can come to those who move to JavaScript, is that without some big, huge tool in place, that JavaScript can have no structure, or can't be X, can't be tested, can't be structured, can't be ordered, whatever. So before we go too far, Chuck, I was hoping you would do the same thing that I did and kind of talk about your background and maybe name some misconceptions that you've seen as you've moved into the JavaScript world.
Okay, so man, I got started programming in college. We did some Java, but I didn't really do anything with web stuff until I was working at Mosey, and I was working with them. I was running their tech support department actually, and we were building a kind of a tech support portal, and that's how I got into Ruby and Rails and web stuff. And interestingly enough, Rails, I don't know if it still has it because I never use it because it was pain, but they used to have this thing called RJS, which was kind of a Ruby-esque way of writing JavaScript. And it wasn't JavaScript proper, it was actually more Ruby. And it also used to have a whole bunch of built-in stuff for actually doing all the AJAX calls for you. So you would just tell it remote true and it would handle it all for you. But I've moved away from that as well. Mainly because I like to have the control, and a lot of times I don't just need it to post back to the back end. I actually need it to do something with a response or things like that, which is where RJS was supposed to come in. But anyway, so a lot of people for a long time spent a lot of time in Ruby and Rails trying to abstract away JavaScript. And I think eventually it just got to the point where people started using things like jQuery and realized that jQuery would let them do most of the common things that they wanted to do without too much trouble. And that's kind of how I moved into things. My first Rails contract, we were using Prototype.js and Scriptaculous. And then the next project, we were using jQuery. And from there, I just kind of picked things up and started writing my own JavaScript where I needed it. And for the most part, if you come from like a C programming background or anything like that, the syntax is pretty straightforward. And so if most of what you're writing is procedural, and that's really what I was doing, was writing procedural JavaScript, I wasn't really taking advantage of eventing or anything like that. It was pretty simple, and I didn't really have a big problem with the language. But I've heard a lot of people talk about JavaScript, and they're just like, it's kind of the unsavory portion of their application. And I kind of see it from the standpoint of, about the 10th time you get dinged because you didn't put a semicolon in, or you forgot to add this curly braces because Ruby doesn't have them or doesn't use them that way. You kind of get frustrated. But, you get used to it. You get used to the evented model, and you start to realize that there's a lot of power on the front end. And that's kind of how I moved into it, was doing that. And then the other thing that really pushed me ahead was when I started attending the users group. So the Utah JS users group that we all are a part of made a big difference, because then I could go and talk to other people who were interested in JavaScript and learn some of the other idioms that surround it. But I'm still not full-time JavaScript. I've only had one project that was 100% JavaScript, and I'm looking forward to using more. Actually, have been playing with Node quite a bit lately. So
go ahead.
I was going to say, here's a question for you, and this isn't me trolling. It really isn't. It seems like the Rails framework, since its conception all the way up to even today and going forward, do everything they can to avoid JavaScript.
I think that's partially true. I don't think it's completely true. But I think they try and provide alternatives. I mean, a lot of it is colored by David Heinemeier Hansson and his opinions of what should be done and how.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you have plugins that pull in the JavaScript libraries and put them in place for you, so you don't even have to do that part.
Or like the way when you post, it'll send back JavaScript to execute. So you could potentially be downloading the same JavaScript over and over again. Well, I guess you cache it, but or like turbo links, or how they make CoffeeScript the default.
Yeah, all of those things. And yes.
That's very Microsoft-y. I mean, Microsoft is that way to the nth degree. They send out all this JavaScript, and it was all this crazy quantities of JavaScript that would just, so that they were trying as hard as possible to keep you from doing any JavaScript. What they would really, the meaning was having to do any JavaScript, but really what they were doing was insulating you from power that you could get. And so you do things in a dumb way. They do these terrible, horrible postbacks.
Well, it's fine for the common case, but when you start to scale your app up, then it really starts to snowball into a really bad idea.
The simple case, not the common case.
Yeah,
I think there's way too many times when
the simple case.
A server developer with a good server technology like .NET, like Rails, will avoid doing something that should be done in JavaScript because they don't have to. They can kind of avoid it, and therefore do something that's far less effective for the users and for the application.
It's so funny because I fall into the trap on the opposite end of the spectrum. Like, it could be done on the server, but I'm like, I'll just do it on the client. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I do that sometimes. I mean, it really depends, though. And I think it's interesting what Joe said, in the sense that, what's best or most powerful for the user. A lot of times I'll opt for the front end or the back end based on how easy it is for me to build it there.
Right.
And so I have more control on the front end, so it's much easier for me to build there, so I'll do it. And other times, I have more control, or I have more of what I need on the back end to just make it happen, and so I'll do it there.
And sometimes you got to consider cost. I do believe that JavaScript development in general is a lot more expensive than server-side web development.
It is.
And so, but I'm excited because I feel like the industry is steadily closing that gap. The more JavaScript frameworks move, the more we get new versions of JavaScript.
The easier it becomes to test.
Yep. And I really feel like in the next 5 to 6 years, we'll see that gap get so close that it just makes so much sense to do a lot more Java front-end development.
Yes and no. And this is one of the fundamental issues with JavaScript, in my opinion, is the fact that in general we have to maintain backward compatibility to these browsers that were written 10 to 15 years ago.
Right.
And so, I mean, the language, yes, it can move forward, and yes, it can give us powerful constructs for working around some of the issues that some of these browsers have, but it still has to give a way for the older browsers to do the thing.
But here's the thing. With ECMAScript 6 becoming something like a transpilation target, like they want people to compile to ECMAScript 6,
right,
I think we as developers are going to write more to an abstraction of what the browsers run rather than directly to the grain of the browsers. So we might all be writing, ES6, and that would transpile as much as possible to ECMAScript 5 or ECMAScript 3. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think at some point the tooling will catch up to a point where, for example, when you write Java, you are able to run on all sorts of platforms because you have this JVM.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're going to see something similar with JavaScript because you're going to write the high-level language and you'll have some sort of compilation target that'll run on these older browsers.
Yeah, so are you talking about having some kind of library that fills the gaps and provides the APIs, or are you talking about actually having it like compile ES6 to ES3?
I'm talking like actual compilation.
Huh, that'd be interesting. I guess my question then becomes, how do you manage that? Because then the browser has to be aware to know which version of the library to pull, which is compatible with it. So. Yeah,
that's true. That's solvable though. That's easy.
It is. But it's still an extra step, and that's the thing. But at the same time, I mean, we've been writing to abstraction layers that take away all that pain for years with things like JavaScript or jQuery or Prototype or what have you, because they know the quirks of the browsers, and so they just they program around them. So they do browser detection or whatever they have to do, find a common way to do it, and then they just take care of it. So when I make an AJAX call, or I manipulate something in the DOM, or I do one of these other things that the library provides for, it knows, well, if I'm running in IE6, then I need to work around it this way. And if I'm running in Opera, then I need to do it this other way.
I'd like to generalize that and say, I feel like smart people are going to solve a lot of problems and just make things a lot easier. The front end is the web is the Wild West. There's so many unsolved problems to solve, and as those problems get solved, it's just going to make development on the front end cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah, but ultimately, if you're writing at low level JavaScript and you're doing specific things that work differently in the browsers, or work certain ways in older browsers that don't work the same way in newer browsers, we still have to maintain that backward compatibility unless we want to break the functionality for those older browsers.
Right.
I do think, though, that you could backwards. I think you could transpile a lot. I mean, there's some features that you can't, you just can't get tail call optimization. Well, maybe you'd be able to do it through a series of complex for loops.
Right.
But there's some features of the language you just are going to have a real hard time.
But let's be honest.
Let alone impossible time.
All we're talking about here is IE. That's really what we're talking about here.
No, there's
no, not
bugs
entirely.
in Firefox.
Yeah, there's bugs, but it's been evergreen
Chrome,
for a while.
All these things,
and they're getting more and more evergreen. The number of people running a non-evergreen version of Chrome is tiny.
IE is a big culprit, but the truth is the ubiquity of the web creates fragmentation in the platform.
Right.
And that's a good thing.
Yes.
Because you get the ubiquity, but consequently, you're writing to multiple platforms. So I think this is a JavaScript problem. I don't think this is an IE problem. I think IE is the biggest culprit of it because they fragment further than everyone else. But I don't think it's fair to...
That's true. But my point was, IE is our biggest culprit, and as time goes by, they're getting better. And I hope someday they're going to figure out and make a decision that they're going to make versions of IE that aren't dependent on the OS. Yeah. And so, they say that IE is evergreen. Well, it's only evergreen so long as you stay on the latest OS. Once you stop and you're on an old OS, your version at some point is going to be capped, right? That's what they're doing right now. And I think they're going to figure that, they're going to change that. I hope they change that policy at some point. We'll have a truly evergreen IE.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that with most of these browsers, you get kind of the incremental updates. So, I've got Firefox on here, and I use it just often enough so that every time I fire it up, it says there's a new version, which is, every month or so. Chrome just updates itself. I don't even pay any attention because it just does it automatically, and I don't even see it.
Right.
And so in a lot of these cases, since it just handles that, you don't have to worry about it. And that's the other issue that I really have with Internet Explorer is it's you get IE 10 or whatever, and you get these minor patches to it, but you're stuck on the main engine for it until they come out with a new super major update.
Isn't that because it's integrated into the OS?
Kind of. It's kind of integrated into the OS. I'm not sure how deep it goes, but it seems like some things it does are things that it works like an independent application, and some things it does, it seems like it ties back into a lot of other things. So I don't know.
Yeah. All I'm saying is we could be asking a lot of Microsoft.
Yeah.
We don't know their code base, right? But
right. And I'd like to move back. I'd like to switch and move back to the whole migrating to JavaScript, since we've definitely segued here into browsers and the problems. But move back into, as you're moving to JavaScript, what are great ways to move to JavaScript? What are misconceptions?
I think misconceptions are that JavaScript is unbearable without certain libraries or tools.
Yeah, that's definitely a big misconception.
Because I totally agree that abstracting away the platform is nice with things like jQuery, but I think people really cripple themselves by not actually trying to understand the language itself.
Right.
And reading that book or listening to that episode with Dave Herman, Effective JS, I think gives a wonderful point of view of some of the interesting things you can do with JavaScript as a language.
Right.
That'll even if you're just writing to jQuery all the time, it'll make your jQuery life better.
Yeah. And I highly recommend to people to go read it. And then when you're done reading it, go read it.
Yeah. It was an excellent book. It really was.
So I feel like my migration to JavaScript, if I could do it over again to make it more effective, the things that I would have done is spend more time right up first learning how to structure my JavaScript code, because the misconception that JavaScript can't be structured is definitely wrong, but it is true that if you don't spend time structuring your JavaScript code, then you end up with crappy code. And that's easier to do in JavaScript than a lot of languages, because it is harder to structure your code. They don't give you very good structures. Even building a class up.
Well, the language itself doesn't have any code sharing mechanisms yet.
Yeah.
I was going to say that in languages like Ruby or Objective-C or some of these others that I've been playing with, they give you very strong idioms, structures, yes, in the language that really give you a way to put your code together. And if you do it the other way, you can. But once you move into classes, or once you move into some of these other structures, you really figure out fast that this is a much easier way to do this, and it's much easier to reason about. And yeah, JavaScript it doesn't have those strong, I don't know if I want to call them opinions with the structures that it gives you, but the structures are so flexible that it doesn't necessarily always say, do it this way.
Yeah, you could write a fully object-oriented system with JavaScript with ease. Well, you'd have to be good at it, or you'd have to understand the language, right? Or prototypes at least.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like, it's less obvious to people.
Well, and I have to say that things like Backbone, I haven't really had a chance to play with Angular. Sorry, Joe. But they were a big win. I mean, jQuery itself was a big win in the sense that it kind of gave me some ways of structuring, because they have some patterns that they show you when you start using it. And then Backbone really gave me a good way of handling that. And again, it's because they provided the structures that I needed to organize my logic.
Yeah. I mean, JavaScript is trying to mitigate that problem. They're actually going to add class semantics. I mean, it's still prototypal inheritance, but they're adding like a class keyword to ECMAScript 6 to try and make that more obvious to people coming from other languages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that'll be a big help for sure.
One other thing that I've seen a lot of people moving to with Node.js is that they found that certain areas of their application, like chat rooms or workflow management or things like that, they work really, really well with an evented system like Node. And so what I've seen is that people have written JSON APIs into Node or into a Node application, and they pass it stuff, and then it does its work in an evented fashion, and when it's done, it spits it back out. And so I've seen some stuff go on like that where, they kind of take a hybrid approach, and so part of their application's in Rails or Sinatra, and part of their application's in Node.js.
All right.
Interesting.
And so that's another transition point on the back end that has some payoffs.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. What about you, Chuck? When you were, as you looked over your move to JavaScript, how would you do it differently if you could do it over again?
For the most part, I think what I would do is just find a way to really learn the core concepts behind JavaScript. I kind of got into it from I need to solve this little problem on my web page, and so I'd go look up some code and copy it over. Go look something up on jQuery.org and copy it over. And I really wish that I had understood deep down what was going on, because I think I could really have more powerfully used the features around the language itself.
So I agree with that, but I do think that oftentimes when you tell people that, and this is true even after having been in JavaScript for a long time, JavaScript is a deep language with a lot of deep holes to go down and learn.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that's true, but I would say that there's a handful of things that you should definitely learn, and learn those, and then worry about learning the other things later, right?
Yes.
And so I think that if it was me and I was making that list, I would say that understanding closures, understanding hoisting, and context are probably the three big things that you should learn. I don't even think that...
I'd take hoisting out.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Clojures, scoping.
Scoping. Maybe scoping's better than hoisting, because hoisting and scoping are... When I say hoisting, what I really mean is like scoping and understanding where variables start and end.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Closures, scoping, and context. I don't even think that understanding the prototypes inheritance system is that important when you're first getting into JavaScript. That becomes like important as a second level for me.
I think if I could do it all over again, I would definitely learn about testing sooner and test driving code.
Awesome. I can't believe you said that before me.
Yeah, that's a byproduct of working with Joe. But like test driving code made a huge difference in terms of just the type of JS I write.
So Joe, when are you going to have him brainwashed into paying us?
True that.
Yeah,
that's another great one is not being afraid of testing JavaScript. That's another either misconception or thing that should be learned because it's code. You should be testing it. In fact, I think it's more important to test JavaScript than it is to test your server-side code because it's so much easier to go wrong in JavaScript. It's a fast, free, loose language.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's a lot that goes on under the hoods that's hard to understand, especially when you're first getting into it. It's so much more important to test your JavaScript.
Yeah. One other thing that I wish I had time to learn a little bit more about is to go and learn some of these other languages that transpile into JavaScript. So I've done quite a bit with CoffeeScript, no surprise there. But go and learn like TypeScript and Dart and some of these other languages, and not just learn them for the sake of understanding the languages, but understand what they're really trying to solve in JavaScript. So what the problems that they see in JavaScript are, and why they're giving you this other alternative to do that, to write in those languages and then transpile it down to JavaScript, and then just understand why those are weaknesses or not of JavaScript itself.
Sure.
Interesting. Yeah. What other common mistakes might people make as they move to JavaScript? Not testing being a big one.
I think a lot of times people are afraid to just deviate off of the common path. So they use the common functions out of jQuery, or they use the common functions out of whatever MVC framework they're using, but they're kind of afraid to do more than just that and some basic procedural stuff, instead of really looking at, okay, what does it mean to put an event on this, and why would it help me?
Right. I'd say that's my number one most common mistake I would list is just doing jQuery and then thinking that everything is jQuery is JavaScript and only thinking in JavaScript in terms of jQuery.
Mm-hmm.
Learning JavaScript through jQuery, if that's how you learn JavaScript, you definitely need to take a step back and learn the language a little bit bigger and make jQuery just a piece of your JavaScript. Structure your JavaScript code and then have your jQuery just be one little piece of that, and not have jQuery be your JavaScript. And look at, I've mentioned before, I worked at a company and this worked fairly well for them, but everything that they did in JavaScript was actually a jQuery plugin. Everything that they did. And it worked out. It worked out just fine for them. But I think they could have actually got a lot more advantages if they had come up with a structure that was JavaScript and jQuery was just mixed into that.
Sure.
So that would be one of my biggest mistakes, is thinking that jQuery and how jQuery does things is really how JavaScript does it. Another potential mistake is, and I'm actually on the fence about this one, but idiomatic JavaScript, right? In lots of anonymous inline functions, lots of closures. I had a conversation with somebody about, is a closure a code smell, right? I had recently learned that C# supports closures. And I had known it supports basically this feature of lambdas for a long time, but you never closed over variables in C#. I never had, and none of the code that I'd ever looked at had ever closed over a variable, right? And so when I found out that in C# you could actually close over a variable identically to the way you do it in JavaScript, I was like astounded, the fact that you could do that. But nobody does it in C#, and I think the big reason is because in C# your context is fixed for functions, where in JavaScript it's not, so people close over variables.
Well, because in JavaScript that's all you have to scope things.
Yeah.
So everything's a global, or you.
Yeah, or you can. Yeah, that's the only way to get it in there is close it over. So, but is a closure a code smell? Because you actually, if you close over a variable, you're coupling your function implementation to that variable, and there's no clear declaration of that. You'd have to actually look inside the body of the function to see, hey, I'm referencing this variable that's declared outside of it, right? So is that a code smell? And so that's kind of idiomatic JavaScript to close over things all the time, when there are ways to get around that. You can bind a functionification to the value of a variable and then invoke the function that way. So there are ways to get around it. So I'm kind of on the fence about certain pieces of idiomatic JavaScript, but I definitely think that if you're coming from a server-side language, trying to write JavaScript like whatever server-side language you're familiar with is a mistake. You should learn to write JavaScript as JavaScript.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you brought that up. Ruby also has closures in blocks, procs, and lambdas. They're all closures.
Oh, really?
Yep.
And you can close over variables, and it'll hold the value within the invocation of the function?
Yep, unless you overwrite it as a local variable or parameter.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I didn't know that you could do that in C# until I actually tried it, just because it's just not done. Nobody does it in C#.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we're running out of time. Are there any other things that you want to bring up to kind of mention on the show before we end it?
Nope. I just want to say the word testing one more time.
Now I'm going to go crawl in a hole with my guilty conscience. You guys can do picks. I don't test my JavaScript as often as I ought to. All right. Well, let's do the picks. Merrick, what are your picks?
So I have a pick that is probably going to be an unpopular one because everyone loves to make fun of this, but I want to pick Dart, the language, and the tools and libraries that they're creating. I think if you looked at Dart at first and you're like, oh man, this thing sucks, you got to give it a second look. They're adding some really interesting things like bindings directly into the language, using libraries, but bindings with observables, kind of like you find in Angular or Ember. MDV, the model-driven views, the shadow DOM. They have an import structure, so you can import code like a module system. It's pretty cool. They're doing some interesting things, and that's dartlang.org. And then the other thing that I wanted to pick is the ECMAScript 6 wiki. It's awesome. There's just all sorts of great information about the upcoming stuff of JavaScript. And I think the best entry point for that is this ES6 Plans. So if you found it kind of impenetrable, I think that's the best page to start with. So those are my picks.
Awesome. Joe, what are your picks?
So my first pick is going to be the TV show Defiance. I've been DVRing it up, and I think the season's over. And I have no idea if it's being canceled or not, and I hope it's not. But I actually just watched the first 2 episodes of it and really, really liked it. And so it was a cool show. It's no Firefly, but I really enjoyed it. It's a cool show, cool sci-fi show. Speaking of which, Under the Dome just started. I'm interested to watch that one. I'm also going to pick America's Got Talent. We watch that as a family every week. And it's just so cool seeing these crazy things that happen. Somebody steps on stage and dressed like a homeless bum and sings better than Pavarotti or can juggle better than the best jugglers in the world. It's just so cool to see these crazy things happen, and you just sit there and go, holy crap, I can't believe that happened. Like this last episode we just watched, there's a woman on a 6-foot unicycle, and she was riding the unicycle with one leg, and with the other leg she was kicking bowls onto another bowl that was on top of her head, like, salad bowls.
Oh, jeez.
She was kicking them. She had 3 of them stacked up on her leg, and she kicked all 3, and all of them fell all together onto this bowl in her head. It was unbelievable. Like, how could a human do that? And what would ever make you think you'd want to learn that? So
I was going to say, how do you figure out you got that talent?
Yeah, it was unbelievable. And then my last pick is going to be esports, specifically StarCraft 2 esports. I love watching StarCraft 2 tournaments, and I feel like it's just like every other sport. You don't have to actually play to enjoy the sport. I think understanding it is definitely important, but you can understand it by watching. But it is an absolutely amazing sport to watch. I love watching the StarCraft 2 tournaments and watching the best players in the world compete and play, and learning new underdogs, and then the dominant forces that you want to see the underdog beat this guy who's been winning every tournament.
Koreans.
Yeah, the Koreans that dominate the world. I love watching StarCraft 2 esports. So that's going to be my third pick and final pick.
Awesome. Well, as far as TV shows go, I've actually been watching Continuum, which is on the Sci-Fi Channel with Defiance. I keep seeing commercials for Defiance, so I'm assuming it's still running. So yeah, I really like that. I've also been watching Fringe with my wife, and we just finished season 4, so I'm now looking at ways to get season 5. another pick that I have is Clean My Mac, which is an application for the Mac. And basically, the reason that I have it is I bought I think it's a 256 gig solid state drive that I run my OS off of. Makes it boot a little bit faster and things, but I tend to fill it up. And so Clean My Mac will go and identify like large files that you ought to look at cleaning up off of your Mac. And it actually cleans up some of the caches that build up on your machine and deletes old versions of applications and things like that. It's really, really good. I usually wind up cleaning up somewhere between 10 and 15 gig off of my hard drive every time I run it. So, and it's stuff that I'm not using. So those are my picks. And yeah, it was a good discussion, guys.
Cool.
So thanks for coming. We'll catch you all next week.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.